Let's look at some awesome tomahawks from Ravensbeak Forge. Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. So like many people out there, I grew up watching things like Last of the Mohicans and Dances with Wolves and things like this. And I've always been very interested in Native American weapons and culture and that period of history. I think it's absolutely fascinating. Now, I've spoken a lot about tomahawks in the past. Tomahawks are a very interesting object because, of course, the form that we're familiar with were trade items, and a lot of them were produced in Europe and also North America and traded to Native Americans. And they're not necessarily similar to the weapons that went before in North America. However, they do have some relationship and certainly in use. So if we look at some of the war clubs and stone-headed clubs that were used prior to the sort of iron-headed axes, then you can use them in a similar way, and that's certainly something I intend to look at in future videos. But this particular type of axe has an interesting origin, and in fact they come in varied forms. So this actually is a hammerhead rather than a pipe hawk, but some of these are pipes, and therefore they combine the pipe with the hatchet or the axe. And this, to bury the hatchet, there's lots of expressions and lots of sort of cultural references we get from this. And they were extremely popular from about the middle of the 19th century onwards, all the way through into the 20th century, in fact, these kind of pipe hawk designs. But there are many different types of tomahawks, and therefore it's somewhat difficult to nail down the origins of some of them. Now, first up, you've seen this tomahawk plenty of times, I think, on this channel, and this is from Ethan Blenkhorn at Ravensbeak Forge. Now, you can find a link below to his website and also his YouTube channel. Go and check that out. He's an absolutely lovely guy making great stuff, and since I've known him, he has expanded what he's made and come on in leaps and bounds with the I guess experience that he's gained making these things and making things that he hadn't done when I first started talking to him. So a really interesting business to keep an eye on, and of course the YouTube channel he's got going there now as well. So check out his links below. Now let's have a look at these. So this is reforged and repurposed from a hammerhead, and he reuses a lot of materials, which is great. Great for the environment and all that kind of stuff, but it's great to take something that's unloved and unused and turn it into something that someone will value. And of course, in many cases, it's using pretty good quality steel, in some cases even historical iron and steel in new products. And I have extolled the virtues of this little tomahawk many times. Now, briefly, I'm just going to talk about tomahawk size. They vary hugely. I've actually done a fair amount more research now than when I first started making videos about Native American weapons in general, but also tomahawks specifically. And the size and the designs varies enormously. Now, the next tomahawk we're going to look at is much bigger than this one, but I just want to briefly say that I just mentioned that I touched on the origins of these. Now, obviously, this was a weapon which appealed to various different Native American groups in North America, so USA and Canada, and because it fit in with what they wanted from a weapon, basically. And it, as I say, it has some parallels of basic characteristics to some of the pre-iron war clubs and maces that were being used in North America beforehand. However, the origins of these is somewhat difficult to pin down because they vary so much in design. Some of these just look like simple hatchets. I don't actually own any of those here, but they look like a simple, hand axe that would have been found all over Europe at the time. And these were very popular trade items, and these, as I say, could be used like a tomahawk. So some of them just seem to be tool axes that were traded with Native Americans, and then they sometimes reshafted them or decorated the shafts, sometimes decorated the heads, and made them their own. And we actually have a parallel for that in New Zealand as well. So the Maoris were very into British traded wood chopping axes, and they mounted them on longer shafts, they decorated the shafts, and they used them as weapons, a little bit like a Dane axe actually. So absolutely, some of the axes that were traded to Native American groups were simply just typical hand axes. However, Some of them were very clearly specifically made, most famously the pipe hawk types, but there are other types as well, and some of these seem to have their origin in things like naval boarding axes. Now, naval boarding axes had been around really since the 17th century. We're more familiar with the 18th and 19th century designs, but they are mentioned in sources going all the way back into the 1600s. And this is the very period, of course, when English and French and Spanish traders were selling things to Native Americans, or exchanging things, you know, for furs and various other things, beads and stuff. So some of these seem to come from hand axes used as tools, or perhaps even wood crafting, carpentry axes. Some of them seem to come from military boarding axes, or rather naval boarding axes. And some of them, as we've mentioned with the pipe hawk types, were specifically made to the tastes of Native Americans and traded to them. So the next axe here is different in a whole bunch of ways. Now, I have showed this a few times on the channel, and I absolutely freaking love this. Again, this is from Ravensbeak Forge, from Easton Blenkhorn, so check out the links below. And this was sort of made to my specifications. I wanted a spontoon hawk. I specifically wanted this design of whatever you want to call these, ears or lugs on the side. As mentioned, I've done quite a bit of research now into these, and these vary in size. Some are even bigger than this. This is a fairly big one. Well, it's kind of like slightly above average, I would say. Some of them are even bigger. You get some massive ones of these. And these lugs vary in shape, design, and direction. Sometimes they curl towards the blade, sometimes they curl away from the blade. And there isn't always, this is actually a functional pipe. I can smoke this. I haven't smoked this yet, I have to say. I did used to smoke, I gave up years ago. So probably not good for my health. But this is a functional pipe, and this is, as you can see, got beautiful decoration, just like the originals. Incised lines here. This kind of applied section on here with the forge welded on pipe, with the lugs here. Some of these are pierced as well. Sometimes you find these with heart-shaped or just circular or other shapes pierced through the blades as decoration, and I suppose it would make the blade lighter. This is a fairly chunky one, okay? And it's fairly sharp as well, actually. I just reminded of that when I brushed my finger against it lightly. This is, in many ways, like a medieval military pick, and this is a sturdy weapon. Now, obviously, it does have a hollow, essentially a pipe, a tube going up the centre to make it into a pipe, which you could say is a point of weakness, perhaps. This is beautifully selected wood that Ethan actually sourced in from outside, and it is slid, the socket is slid up the shaft, and you'll notice it's wider at the top here, with a, I was going to say decorative, but it's not actually. That is essentially plugging the hole that runs through the shaft to make it smokable. So that's plugged at the top, but it looks like a decorative nail at the top. And this is a very substantial weapon. Now, not only would this be obviously effective against Native American people who are generally wearing, at most, clothes made of various things, including hide and fabric, traded fabric, but this is such a formidable weapon that this would also be effective against certain types of armour. And in fact, there were certain North American tribes that did wear forms of armour, and I've actually seen essentially a hide, like a buff jacket, buff coat, covered in Chinese traded brass coins used as scales, so scale armour. And there were various groups actually that made armour of organic and then later traded metal things. So armour was actually a thing amongst certain Native American tribes, particularly in the sort of 17th and 18th century. I think as guns became more prolific, it kind of dropped by the wayside a bit, but nevertheless, armour was a thing. Now, is this an anti-armour weapon, and where did the spontoon tomahawk come from? It seems to be associated with French manufacture and French trade. So incidentally, the reason it's called a spontoon hawk or spontoon tomahawk is because put that way round on a spear shaft, this looks like a sergeant's spontoon, which was a type of weapon that sergeants carried in the 17th and 18th centuries as a spear, essentially with lugs, like a little partisan. It's a descendant of the partisan, and it was carried by sergeants and other NCOs sometimes as their weapon, as their badge of office, and for fighting with as well. So the fact that the head looks like a spontoon meant that they got referred to as spontoon tomahawks, and they still are referred to this. Now, there does seem to be an association between the kind of this type being found in more Anglo areas. So it does seem that the Brits and the English-speaking North Americans were making this type of hatchet and simple hatchets. And it does seem that this spontoon hawk seem to be more popular in French areas. Now, for anyone who doesn't know, North America, both what became the USA later and Canada, there were areas that were highly colonized by British people, English-speaking people. There were areas that were colonised by French-speaking people. Obviously, this leads to the modern Canada, and there were areas that were populated primarily by other groups such as Spanish, Portuguese, Dutch, German, so on and so forth. However, by the early part of the 18th century, so the 1700s, essentially the French and the British were the dominant groups in North America, both what became the USA and Canada. And of course there were wars, and the British effectively, through a combination of war and buying parcels of land, essentially forced out the French influence. Of course, the French weren't happy about this, and in the American War of Independence, therefore, the French gave an enormous amount of support to the revolutionaries, which partially enabled them to force the British out. Look up the Battle of Chesapeake Bay. It's essentially a French victory over the British Royal Navy. And without the Battle of Chesapeake Bay, the American Revolution would have panned out somewhat differently. So yeah, the French were instrumental in pushing the British out. But earlier on, if we go back to the last of the Mohicans kind of period, then you will see that there are certain Native Americans who allied themselves politically, sometimes even religiously, with the French. Some of them converted to Catholicism. The British were predominantly Protestant, and there were Native American groups who allied themselves with the British. Incidentally, after the American War of Independence, if you look to the War of 1812, for example, in that kind of period, you will find there are certain Native American groups who now living under the USA, living under American government, weren't very happy with that, and some of them allied themselves with the British still after the British had been pushed out of North America. So, very complicated and very interesting period. But why am I talking about this? Because it relates to tomahawk design. It does mean that there is a political element to having a certain type of tomahawk and buying it from certain people. So it does seem that these type of spontoon hawks were associated with Native American groups who were more influenced or allied with the French, and this type were more influenced with those who were allied or trading with the British. Now, there is a third type of tomahawk, and this has just been received a few days ago, in fact, about 4 or 5 days ago, and this is the third one. So first of all, there we go, that's the last look of the spontoon hawk. Fascinating, awesome and big and really powerful weapon, and at some point I might do some testing of this. I know Ethan wants me to put this against armour, but I don't want to damage it. I love it. These are beautifully made and hand forged, of course, by him in Canada. So the last one, and the most recent one to arrive, in many ways, this is the tomahawk that I would choose if I was going back in time to, let's say 1780, and I was going to go and live in the woods in North America, so USA or Canada, which I have to say, minor point of interest, I think if I was British at that time, I probably would emigrate, because there were all sorts of advantages for a typical, working or middle class person to move to the USA or Canada at that time. A lot more land, a lot more possibilities, real frontier. I think it's a fascinating bit of history. But anyway, this is probably the type of tomahawk that I personally would choose. Ta-da! It is a tomahawk with a spike on the back, and I just think this is the best of all worlds. Now, does it come with any disadvantages? Well, I'll talk about that in a second, actually. But first of all, the obvious advantage is you now have a hatchet and you have a spike. But also, it gives a sort of balance to the weapon. Now, you'll notice that certain weapons, certain axes rather, specifically, have a hammer or some projection on the back, this is true even of poleaxes, medieval poleaxes, that gives them a certain degree of balance, but usually the axe blade, with the exception of poleaxes actually, usually the axe blade is more heavy. It will naturally weigh down that way, and certainly on most tomahawks this is nowhere near the mass of the front projection. Especially true in this case. I mean, the spontoon hawk really wants to go that way. Now that has some advantage to it, in that it really helps with indexing and alignment, and if you have a blade which is heavy in one direction, it will naturally always point in the right direction. And if you ever, if you chop wood with axes, you'll notice this, or even if you just hit things with hammers, usually the predominant mass will align itself. So even though this has a teardrop shaped shaft, something that I'm a big fan of, to aid indexing and alignment, just having a one side heavy will do that naturally anyway. So you can have axes with cylindrical shafts, and they do seem to sort of work anyway. They align themselves most of the time. Now, you could say that's a disadvantage when you've got a large projection on both sides. However, this does have a teardrop section shaft. Hardwood, I think it's probably hickory, it might be ash, but I think it's hickory, American wood. So traditionally in Europe we use ash. Once hickory was available from America, hickory is stronger than ash, although ash is lighter. So, different strengths and weaknesses. And this is forged in much the same way, but this has a beautiful beak or spike on the back. Now that would be very, very good at getting through armour, types of armour. So that would be effective against mail more than a blade would be. But more importantly and more applicable for this period, if we're looking at North America, particularly the northern parts, and Canada, certainly a lot of the year people are going to be wearing quite thick clothing. Now, one of the problems with the tomahawk is that it's not a massively heavy weapon, and so if you hit someone in most parts of their torso, perhaps even the upper legs if it's covered by a long coat, it's not actually going to have very much effect. Now, for that reason, I've looked at primary sources. Look up my tomahawk. If you search for the word tomahawk in my videos, you'll find other material if you haven't seen it already. Most references to using the tomahawk in colonial North America involve hitting the head, and that's absolutely fine if you can hit the head. But the thing with the spike is you can apply that to any part of the body, the arms, the legs, the torso, and it will still go through the clothing. So quite simply, if a person is dressed up in thick clothes, maybe with a raccoon hat or whatever, or any type of helmet, the spike is going to be a more effective weapon than the axe blade is. But the axe blade, of course, is more useful as a tool. So I kind of feel like this spike, ow, I got right on the end there. This type of spike tomahawk is more versatile as a weapon and a tool, I think, than the type with a hammer on the back. And it doesn't have the inherent weakness of a pipe hawk, which has a hollow going through the shaft, which potentially makes the shaft weaker. So this is, to me, and also it's like a boarding axe. So this actually, if we called this a boarding axe, I don't think anybody would really argue with me. It's a bit small for a boarding axe. Now, in terms of size, this is, funnily enough, I've actually in the last few months, I have actually done some sparring with tomahawks because I have a sparring tomahawk now. And my experience is that against a Bowie knife, the tomahawk has the advantage in general, so long as you know what you're doing. So if you have someone who knows what they're doing with the knife and the tomahawk has an advantage. If you give someone who doesn't really know what they're doing the tomahawk, then the person with the Bowie knife can sort of bring the balance up to 50-50 or even better if they're a good fencer. But overall, I would say because it's got the reach advantage over most Bowie knives, and one hit with this in the hand is very debilitating, whether it's with the spike or an axe blade. So if a knife wielding opponent comes at you, if you keep distance and target their arm and hand, you can basically take out their limb that's holding the knife. Now obviously that's what the knifeman will be trying to do, but you can outrange them with this. So it's a very, very formidable weapon. Maybe the knife can kill more quickly. Obviously a head hit with this will kill someone pretty quickly, but the knife can, puncture the body as well as the throat and blah, 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 and put someone out of action very, very quickly. But to the right regions, I think this is a very debilitating and effective weapon. And as mentioned, it is the same design, or essentially the same design, as a boarding axe, as a naval boarding axe, which were hugely popular items to have on board ships for all sorts of purposes, but they were used as weapons as well, particularly by the French, incidentally. It seems that the British preferred cutlasses. The French really liked their axe de board, as they called it, the boarding axe. Yeah, a very versatile and successful weapon. And also, if we look back to medieval axes, I mean, really, if we look at the time of, Robert the Bruce, when I think it's de Bohun, hits in the head with a helmet with the axe. If we go back to the 13th century, this is kind of what a battle axe looks like. So it's smaller, it's easier to wear on the belt and carry around, and it's not having to contend with medieval armor. But the fundamental design is one that goes back an awful long way and was very, very successful. And although this isn't the most famous style of tomahawk used in North America, people tend to think more about the sort of hammerhead or pipe hawk design or the spontoon hawk. This type was carried as well. It is shown in period photographs carried by Native Americans and illustrations. And some of them undoubtedly were just remounted boarding axes, naval boarding axes, sold to Native Americans or traded, bartered. So absolutely, this is an important third type of Native American tomahawk, and aesthetically and in use, it just so happens to be my favourite as well. So thank you very, very much. And it says Ravensbeak Forge on the side there in very faint letters, but it's nice to just have that on there. So thanks so much to Ethan for sending those. And I just briefly mention as well, so check out the link below to Ravensbeak Forge. He does make other things as well. And he has sent me this really cute little skindoo, which is a type of Scottish Highland particularly knife that you wear in the top of your sock usually when you're wearing a kilt. Now, I don't own a kilt, but I am part Scottish. In fact, I'm quite a bit, Scottish is the most of what I am apart from English. So yeah, absolutely. Some of my ancestors would have probably worn these. This is, yeah, just a really nice utilitarian forged, decent edge on it. Yeah, pretty decent. I can probably make that better. But with a crown of a antler, stag antler handle, just in a nice little leather sheath, and that would stick in the top of your sock. Interesting note, even in British law there is an exemption for wearing these because it's part of Highland dress. So you can walk around the streets of Britain wearing a skindoo, so long as you also wear a kilt and all of the other bits of Highland costume or dress, traditional dress. So thank you so much to Ethan for sending these. I'll do some more videos in the future about tomahawks. Is there something specific about tomahawks you'd like me to test or talk about, research, historical sources? Let me know in the comments down below, or indeed Highland Scottish weapons. That's probably something I need to turn a little bit more attention to, especially as I have some around here and another one now. So check out the links below to Ravensbeak Forge. Thanks to Ethan for sending this stuff. They will feature in future videos as well. And I hope you've enjoyed watching this, and I'll see you again soon on the channel. Cheers, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.